Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision, right? Like engineering.
Right. It's binary.
All right,
It's either broken or it's not.
exactly. Broken or not broken. It's clean. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is. That's the break.
And honestly, that's incredibly comforting.
Yeah.
We human beings, we like things to be visible. We like them to be categorized.
Yeah, put into neat little boxes.
Which makes perfect sense, Amy, because it gives us this illusion of control over our environment.
But then if you step into the world of, say, neurodevelopment or complex psychological trauma, suddenly that x-ray machine is it's broken. You can't just point to a white line on a screen anymore.
No, not at all. You find yourself looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah, you're dealing with spectrums, shifting definitions, and just evolving understandings of the human brain.
And I was thinking about that exact feeling, that distinct psychological shift from wanting a clean binary x-ray to realizing you are swimming in the muddy waters when I was looking through the massive stack of notes for today.
Oh, yeah. The notes for this one are wild.
Because today we are doing a deep dive into something that touches on that exact same fundamental human desire for absolute black and white certainty, but in a completely different realm.
A vastly different realm.
Welcome to another deep dive. I am so genuinely glad you could join us today because the mission we have in front of us is honestly one of the most fascinating institutional and, well, philosophical puzzles I have ever seen.
It really is a masterclass in how a massive ancient structure deals with the messy reality of human existence over a really long period of time.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our source material today is a comprehensive collection of notes, historical excerpts, and theological analyses titled Development of Dogma. And our specific mission for this deep dive is to unpack how an institution that explicitly claims to possess absolute, eternal, and infallible truth handles the incredibly awkward reality of changing its mind.
Or at the very least, how it handles appearing to change its mind to an outside observer.
Yes, because we are looking specifically at the Catholic Church's historical teaching on salvation.
Specifically, we are tracing the evolution of a famous and historically quite terrifying Latin phrase, extra ecclesiam dula salis.
Which translates to, outside the church, there is no salvation.
Right. And I want to set the stakes for you right at the top of this deep dive.
Yeah, please do.
This isn't just a dry, dusty theology lesson for people who, like to argue about medieval European history.
No, definitely not.
This is a masterclass in institutional survival. It's about linguistics, it's about the evolution of human thought, and it is about the extreme, almost breaking point tension between claiming to hold an infallible truth and living in a real world.
A real world where history, science, and geography just keep throwing massive curveballs at you.
Exactly. It asks a fundamental sociological question, really. How does any organization survive for 2 millennia without snapping under the weight of its own rigid rules?
That is the core question. Now, as we get into this, I want to seamlessly weave in a bit of a grounding thought here. Because whenever you start analyzing religious documents, especially Catholic history, people's defenses can go up.
Oh, absolutely. The guards come up immediately.
Right. The sources we are unpacking today touch on deeply religious, highly sensitive, and intensely debated historical and political themes. And I want to be crystal clear with you, the listener, our job here today is not to take a side.
No, we are definitely not endorsing any specific religious worldview.
Right. We aren't here to validate the traditionalist Catholic defenders who say, nothing has ever changed. And we aren't here to high-five the secular critics who say it's all a massive sham.
Our only goal, our mission, is to impartially unpack the fascinating architectural arguments contained in this source material.
Exactly. We want you to understand the mechanics of this massive historical pivot for yourself. We are just unrolling the blueprints and looking at the gears.
And the blueprints show a massive structural redesign over the centuries. Just to give you the bird's eye view of the core conflict we are exploring today, the Church once taught in explicit authoritative writing that you must literally, physically be a subject of the Roman pontiff.
The Pope.
Yes, the Pope, to avoid eternal fire. There were zero visible exceptions written in the text.
But today, the exact same institution teaches that sincere seekers of God who are entirely outside the visible Catholic Church, who maybe don't even know what a pope is, can potentially be saved.
Which is a staggering pivot.
I mean, it's huge. So to understand the modern nuance, to understand how they managed to get away with that massive shift without the whole institution crumbling, we first have to establish the baseline.
You have to go back to the Middle Ages.
Right. To an era of absolute terrifying literalism. A period our sources describe as the join or burn era.
To really set the stage properly, it's super helpful to look at how the early church, like the very first few centuries of Christians, viewed this idea of outside the church there is no salvation. Because it didn't actually start out as a weapon.
Really? How did they use it then?
In the early church, the focus of that phrase was primarily on unity. It was a desperate plea to a persecuted community.
Oh, like, hey, stay in the boat. The Roman Empire is actively trying to kill us.
Exactly. It's rough out there. Stick together.
Yeah.
It was pastoral. It was an inward-facing warning against schism. The early bishops were basically saying, don't leave the community, because this community is the only one that has the sacraments, the Eucharist, the teachings of the apostles.
So it wasn't about damning the unbaptized people in the next town over.
No, it was about keeping the flock together in a deeply hostile world. But, as our sources detail, by the time we get to the Middle Ages, that focus shifts dramatically. It shifts from unity to authority.
And that brings us to the year 1302. This is the peak of the literalist mountain. We have a document, a papal bull, called Unam Sanctam, written by Pope Boniface VIII.
Oh, yeah. That document is intense.
I want to read the definitive claim from the end of this text, because when you hear it, I mean, it leaves absolutely no room for imagination or metaphor. Boniface wrote, "Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff."
Wow.
Yeah, no nuance there.
And what's absolutely fascinating here is the political context behind that incredibly aggressive, sweeping language. You have to understand that Pope Boniface wasn't just sitting in a quiet room at the Vatican doing, like, abstract spiritual theology.
Right, he was locked in a bitter, high-stakes, real-world power struggle with King Philip V of France.
Exactly. King Philip, trying to consolidate his own power, was attempting to tax the French clergy and assert state power over the church's lands and wealth. Boniface was aggressively pushing back against that.
So this theological decree was, at its core, a massive jurisdictional claim.
It was a political flex wrapped in theological terror. He's essentially telling the King of France, listen, if you don't submit to my ultimate authority, you are off the ark of salvation. You are going to drown, and your soul is going to burn.
Right. The church was using the ultimate metaphysical threat, eternal damnation, to enforce a terrestrial political reality. If you weren't under the Pope's literal, legal, organizational authority, you were out. It was a strict boundary marker.
But they didn't stop there. The language actually gets more intense and even more specific a little later on.
Yeah. Let's fast forward a bit to the Council of Florence in 1441. Our sources detail an explicit authoritative decree from this council that says, and I quote, "Pagans, Jews, heretics, and schismatics will go to the eternal fire unless they are joined to the Catholic Church before the end of their lives."
That is the definitive text of the era. And again, context is absolutely everything here. When modern readers look at that, they naturally recoil. It sounds horrific.
It really does.
But we have to ask, why did they use language that rigid, that specific, and that unforgiving? Because they were operating in the era of Christendom.
The medieval bubble, like a giant echo chamber.
Right. The church's working assumption in 1441 was that literally everyone in the known world had already been exposed to the gospel. The apostles had supposedly preached to the ends of the earth.
So they weren't sitting around thinking about uncontacted peoples on hidden continents.
Not at all. They were addressing people they perceived as active, willful rebels. If you weren't in the church in 1441 Europe, the theological assumption was that you knew about the church, you knew it was the true path, and you had willfully, stubbornly decided to reject it.
But I want you, the listener, to really put yourself in the shoes of an average peasant living in, say, 1302 or 1441. You are hearing this decreed from the pulpit.
Yeah, imagine that experience.
If your neighbor is an unbaptized traveler or a Jewish merchant down the street, you are being told with the full weight of infallible divine authority that they are going to burn in eternal fire. Period. Full stop.
It's heavy.
It's incredibly heavy. And I have to ask, how does a seemingly loving religion justify that level of extreme, unyielding rigor on the ground? It feels so deeply out of step with the concept of a merciful God that they also preached.
It definitely feels contradictory to the modern ear.
Yeah.
But it was an era defined by deep tribalism and a survivalist mindset.
Mm.
You have to remember, the structure of medieval society was incredibly fragile.
Oh, for sure. Disease, famine, constant warfare.
The church believed that enforcing absolute religious uniformity was literally the only way to hold Western civilization together. They built a massive theological fortress to keep the chaos out.
But here is the fatal flaw with building a fortress based on your current map of the world. What happens when the map expands?
What happens when reality outgrows your fortress walls?
And that is exactly what happened. This rigid, localized European worldview was about to collide head-on with a geographical reality that would literally break their theological map in half.
We are talking, of course, about the discovery of the Americas, the so-called New World.
Just imagine the sheer theological crisis this caused in the Vatican. Put yourself in the room with those theologians.
Panic. It had to be panic.
You've spent centuries drawing a hard, unyielding line, submit to the Pope, and be baptized with water or burn in hell forever because you have absolutely no excuse not to know the gospel. And then suddenly, European explorers come back.
And they say, hey, so, funny story, there are entire continents across the ocean.
We're talking millions and millions of people, massive empires, and they have literally never heard of Jesus, the Pope, Rome, the Bible, or anything else.
They've been there for thousands of years.
This raised a profound philosophical and moral question, one that I think you, the listener, can immediately appreciate regardless of your background.
Would a truly just and loving God damn someone to eternal fire for not knowing something they couldn't possibly know? This is a massive crisis of divine justice.
It's the ultimate test of fairness, and it forced the church into a massive paradigm shift. They couldn't ignore the newly discovered continents.
No, the evidence was undeniable.
They had to figure out how to pivot the requirement for salvation from strict membership in a visible, European-centric organization to some kind of internal relationship with God.
And our sources give us a really clear timeline of how this clarification or retraction or backpedaling, depending on how cynical you want to be, played out over the next few centuries.
The first major crack in the literalist armor happens officially in 1854 with Pope Pius IX.
Now, context is super important here. Pius IX was a very conservative pope. He was not some radical, progressive reformer trying to tear down the old ways.
Right.
Yet even he recognized that the strict 1441 formula was totally unsustainable in a globalized world. He had to introduce a crucial theological concept to deal with the reality of the expanded map.
And what was that concept?
He formally introduced the idea of invincible ignorance.
Invincible ignorance. I love that term so much. It sounds like an absolute superpower, like something a Marvel villain would have.
It does, but it's actually a massive theological loophole.
Explain how it works.
It is a profound shift in moral theology. The concept of invincible ignorance dictates that if you are ignorant of the true religion through absolutely no fault of your own meaning, your ignorance is invincible and cannot be overcome by your own reasonable efforts.
Like if you live on an island in the Pacific and no missionary has ever arrived.
Exactly. If that's the case, you bear no moral guilt for that ignorance before the eyes of the Lord. You are not punished for what you could not know. You are essentially grandfathered into the possibility of mercy.
But here's the thing. The tension didn't just magically go away because a pope mentioned invincible ignorance in the 1800s.
No, you still had centuries of terrifying literalist momentum built up in the minds of the faithful.
Right. People were still clinging to the old rigid rules because that's what their great-grandparents were taught. Which brings us to 1949 and a story that I absolutely love from our sources because it perfectly encapsulates this friction. The Boston Heresy.
Ah, yes. The fascinating case of Father Leonard Feeney. If you want to understand the growing pains of this dogma, this is the ultimate modern test case.
Let's really paint the picture here. Father Feeney was a very popular, charismatic Jesuit priest in Boston in the 1940s. He had a massive following.
Huge following.
And he essentially looked back at the Council of Florence from 1441, read the decree that said pagans and Jews go to the eternal fire unless they join the visible Catholic Church. And he said, hey, they were infallible, right? They meant what they said.
So he taught the strict 14th century literalism.
Yeah. No water baptism, no heaven, no exceptions, no invisible ropes, no invincible ignorance. If you aren't a baptized Catholic, you are going to hell. He was preaching the old medieval join or burn doctrine right in the middle of pluralistic 20th century America, rubbing shoulders with Protestants and secular folks in Boston.
And he was gaining immense traction. which deeply worried the local archbishop. And
Yeah.
this raises an incredibly thorny, awkward question for the institution. What exactly does the Vatican do when a priest faithfully preaches a document that the Vatican itself wrote and declared infallible 500 years earlier?
Here's where it gets really interesting and where the gears of the institution really show themselves. The Vatican actually stepped in and condemned Feeney's view.
Wait, they condemned him for quoting them.
Basically, in 1949, they officially clarified against Feeney that a desire for the church, even an implicit, unspoken, unconscious desire by someone trying to live a good life, could suffice for salvation.
Wow.
By officially condemning Feeney and eventually excommunicating him for disobedience, the church proved through its actions that it had officially practically rejected the rigorism of its own 14th century decrees. They literally labeled his strict literalism a heresy of rigorism.
Think about the absolute irony of that. He was a heretic for believing exactly what a pope said 600 years prior.
It is a stunning historical moment, and that trajectory moving away from Feeney's literalism culminates definitively in the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council, commonly known as Vatican II.
This is where the modern nuanced stance is completely solidified and baked into the modern catechism. The Church now teaches that salvation still fundamentally comes from Christ, through the Church. The Church remains the unique source of grace, but those who seek God with a sincere heart, living according to the dictates of their conscience, can be saved by the Church's grace.
Even if they aren't card-carrying, baptized members of the visible institution.
Exactly. So the focus of this one phrase, outside the Church there is no salvation, shifted from a plea for unity in the early Church to a weapon of authority in the Middle Ages to what our sources beautifully call mystery in the modern era.
It became an acknowledgement that God's mercy extends infinitely beyond the visible, bureaucratic borders of the Catholic Church.
The map expanded, and the theology expanded to fill it.
But I want to stop right here. I want to hit pause, and I want to ask the core question. I want to ask you, the listener, to really think about this. Does this mean the Church was just flat out wrong in the Middle Ages?
Oof, that is the big one.
I mean, structurally, logically, if they wrote a document that said only X can be saved in 1441, and then they write a document that says actually non-X can be saved in 1965, didn't they just make a mistake? Didn't they fail at their one job?
This is the million-dollar question of Catholic theology. And it is a question that, frankly, threatens the very foundation of the institution.
Because if an institution claims to be divinely guided, protected by the Holy Spirit, and infallible in its core teachings on faith and morals, it cannot simply shrug its shoulders and say, oops, our bad, we made a mistake back then. Sorry about the centuries of existential terror.
Right. You can't be infallible and say, my bad. It's an oxymoron.
So how do they explain this? How do they explain this massive, undeniable pivot from the terrifying rigidity of 1302 to the sweeping inclusivity of the 1860s without admitting institutional defeat? How do they thread that impossible needle?
They do it by relying on some very intricate, highly developed theological analogies and mechanisms of doctrinal shift. They refuse to call it a change. They exclusively call it a development.
Okay, development.
And one of the primary ways they explain this development to the faithful is through the analogy of Noah's Ark. This analogy beautifully addresses the tension between the necessity of the Church and the access to it.
Let's unpack the ark metaphor because I think it brilliantly illustrates the shift in their thinking. In the medieval view, the ark is entirely literal. If the floodwaters of sin and death are rising and you are not physically standing on the wooden deck of the boat, you drown, period.
You need a ticket, you need to be on board, you need the Pope as your captain.
Exactly. But in the modern view, post-Vatican II, the Church says, yes, the boat is still the only thing that floats. The boat is absolutely necessary for salvation. We aren't changing that rule.
However, they argue that there are invisible ropes trailing off the sides of the boat deep into the water.
Right, so someone might be miles away from the deck, thrashing in the waves, completely unaware that a boat even exists, but through following their conscience, they manage to grab hold of a rope. They are being saved by the boat even though they aren't on the boat.
It's a great image. The source of salvation remains exclusive. It's still the ark. But the application of that salvation becomes incredibly expansive.
And they pair this ark analogy with that concept we mentioned earlier, invincible ignorance. But our sources describe invincible ignorance as something very specific in legal terms. They call it a fine print clause.
Right. It acts as a retrospective theological fine print. The Church hasn't technically erased the medieval decrees from the history books. Rather, theologians claim that the spirit of invincible ignorance was always there. hidden in the fine print of the original decrees,
Even if the popes of the time didn't articulate it.
even if they didn't articulate it.
The logic is wild, but if you look at it from a purely legal standpoint, it kind of tracks internally. They argue that you are only guilty of a mortal sin of leaving the true church if you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is the true church established by Christ, and you consciously, maliciously, willfully reject it anyway.
So when the medieval popes were condemning people to hell, modern theologians argue they were only condemning the willful, malicious rejection of known truth, not innocent ignorance.
Exactly. And this relies on a crucial distinction that modern Catholic theologians make between formal membership and material membership in the church.
Yep.
Break that down for us. What does that actually look like in practice?
Let's use two hypothetical people.
Yeah.
Formal membership is what we traditionally think of. You're baptized with water, your name is in the parish registry, you go to Mass on Sundays, you recognize the authority of the Pope.
You are formally, visibly on the books. Okay, that's easy. That's the 1441 definition. What about material membership?
Material membership is about the internal disposition of the soul. It's about living a life in accordance with whatever light or truth you have received from God, however limited that might be.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say you have a person born into a remote culture, or even a person born into a deeply secular modern city who has only ever seen the church act hypocritically, right? And therefore rejects it out of a sincere sense of moral outrage.
Sure.
The church believes that if that person genuinely seeks the good, loves their neighbor, and follows the dictates of their conscience, they have an implicit desire to be part of God's truth, because God is truth.
So therefore, without knowing it, they are materially members of the Catholic Church.
Yes, they belong to the soul of the church, even if they are entirely disconnected from the body of the church.
So the church looks at all this history, points to the material members, and says, see, we weren't wrong in the Middle Ages. We were just incomplete in our explanation.
Exactly. And they use another very famous analogy in the sources to justify this continuity, the acorn to oak tree theory.
Yes, this theory is absolutely foundational to modern Catholic apologetics. It originates with an early Christian thinker named Saint Vincent of Lerins, but it was heavily expanded upon and popularized in the 19th century by Cardinal John Henry Newman.
Newman has this incredible quote in the sources, and it stopped me in my tracks when I read it.
Oh, yeah?
He wrote, "To live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often."
That is a wild, almost subversive thing for a high-ranking leader in a rigid, traditional, supposedly infallible institution to say out loud.
It was revolutionary at the time. Newman argued that dogma, the core teachings of the church, progresses over time, but it doesn't change its fundamental substance.
You laid out criteria, right?
Yeah. A development is only valid if it preserves the original type or core idea, if it has chronic vigor, meaning it lasts and bears good fruit, and if it is a logical, organic consequence of what came before.
So, using Newman's framework, the Church argues that the strict, terrifying statement of 1302 was the acorn. It was the seed. The highly nuanced, inclusive understanding of 1965 is the mature oak tree.
Right. If you look at an acorn and an oak tree side by side, they look completely different. But biologically, essentially, it's the exact same organism.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back on this. I understand the acorn and the oak tree, but our sources actually bring up a fascinating philosophical distinction here between development and mutation.
Ooh, yes.
And I think this is where the traditionalist critics and the secular critics both have a massive point. Because I hear the acorn and the oak tree, and I get it. Development is a child growing into a man. The child grows up. Maybe he has a beard now. Maybe he's taller. He's learned some things, but he's fundamentally the exact same human person.
Right.
But a mutation is a dog turning into a cat. That is a total, undeniable change of nature.
And you are arguing that the historical shift in the salvation doctrine is a mutation, not a development.
I'm arguing that if you write a papal bull in 1302 that says only X can be saved, and then centuries later you write a council document in 1965 that says actually non-X can be saved, aren't you changing the fundamental predicate of the sentence? You aren't just letting a child grow up and get a beard, you are turning a dog into a cat. The core truth seems to have flipped a full 180 degrees. How is that an acorn growing?
You know, that is the exact critique that traditionalists make. And honestly, it's a difficult corner for the institution to fight its way out of. It is the central tension.
So how do they fight their way out?
Here is how the Vatican's top minds try to justify it. How does the Church defend against the accusation that the dog turned into a cat? By arguing that they changed the definition of the subject itself. They changed the definition of the church.
What do you mean? They just redefined the words.
Yes. In the Middle Ages, when Pope Boniface said the church, he meant the visible physical organization, the institution with the stone buildings, the tax collectors, the crusades, the bishops, and funny hats. He meant the geopolitical entity.
Okay.
When a modern pope says the church, in the context of salvation, he is often referring to a mystical reality, a spiritual body, the mystical body of Christ that transcends the visible institution.
Wow.
By expanding the definition of the word church from a visible geographic club to a mystical, invisible energy that pervades the cosmos, they avoid admitting a direct logical contradiction.
So they can look you in the eye and say, the rule never changed. You still have to be in the church to be saved. We just realized the church is much, much bigger and more invisible than we thought in 1302.
Exactly. It's the reframing of the entire premise.
That is some incredible linguistic gymnastics. It's brilliant, honestly, from a survival standpoint. But it brings us to another angle we desperately need to explore. We've looked at the theological, how they explain the shift using acorns and invisible ropes and redefining words, but we need to look at the historical why.
The sociology of it.
Right. Why did this happen when it did? Did God suddenly decide to reveal more truth in the 1960s, or did the modern secular world just force the church's hand?
Now we are moving from pure theology into sociology and history. And the church has a sophisticated defense for this historical timing, too. They call it the pedagogy defense, or the idea of God acting as a divine teacher.
I found this part of the source material utterly fascinating. Explain the pedagogy defense for the listener.
The theory suggests that God treats humanity like a student progressing through grades in a classroom. You don't teach a kindergartner the extreme nuances of quantum physics or moral relativism. Their developing brains simply can't handle it.
Right.
Instead, you give them strict, binary black and white rules for their own safety. Don't touch the stove. Look both ways before you cross the street.
Join the Catholic Church or burn in hell forever.
Exactly. The theological argument is that the Middle Ages were a chaotic, violent, intellectually rudimentary time defined by tribalism and survival. In that specific environment, a strict, uncompromising, terrifying teaching served a pedagogical purpose.
It kept the community unified and protected the sacraments from being diluted. It was the stern voice of a parent.
But as humanity matured into the modern age, an era characterized by global pluralism, advanced mass communication, and a much deeper philosophical understanding of human rights and psychology, a strictly literal teaching would no longer protect the flock.
It would actively drive thinking people away.
Right. So God allowed the fuller, more nuanced truth of his expansive mercy to be revealed because humanity was finally mature enough to understand the ropes trailing from the ark.
It's all about what the sources call the conditions of the times. In 1302, Unam Sanctum was essentially a giant neon keep-out sign directed at a power-hungry French king. It was political armor masquerading as theology.
And by 1965, the world had fundamentally changed.
We had just survived two horrific world wars, the Holocaust, the detonation of the atomic bomb, and the rise of global state-sponsored atheism in the Soviet Union. The existential threats had changed from King Philip wanting tax money to the potential annihilation of the human race.
So the church's response, guided by this pedagogy, shifted to emphasize human dignity, religious freedom, and universal grace.
It presents the church as a responsive, deeply empathetic teacher, but there is a glaring flaw in this defense, isn't there?
Oh, a massive one, and our sources call it the one-job critique.
I really want to dig into this because it's the most devastating counter-argument. Think about it. The Catholic Church claims to have been founded directly by God himself, with essentially one job to preserve, protect, and teach accurately on the issue of human salvation.
They literally claim to hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven.
If this institution is a divine hospital established to cure the disease of sin, and the people running it got the core formula for the cure dangerously incomplete or outwardly terrifying for 1,500 years, doesn't that make the whole thing feel entirely like a human invention?
It's a devastatingly fair point. If the church is supposed to be the forefront of understanding, the beacon of light in a dark world, as it claims, how could it be so remarkably, embarrassingly late to the realization that non-Catholics could be saved?
Right. Why did it take them centuries to catch up to basic human empathy?
If the church only updates its teachings on faith and morals, when the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and modern secular human rights movements force its hand and make its old teachings look barbaric, then it really looks like the secular world is leading the church to truth, not the other way around.
It looks like theology is just desperately following sociology.
And if we connect this to the bigger historical picture, the evidence for that critique is really strong. The church's internal structure and theology often look remarkably like a mirror of the world's secular political power structures at any given time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, think about it. During the Roman Empire, the church structures itself exactly like the empire, with dioceses and bishops acting essentially as Roman princes.
During the feudal Middle Ages, the church begins to act like the ultimate feudal lord, framing salvation as a matter of fealty or submission to the pope, exactly how a serf submits to a lord.
And then, during the Enlightenment and the modern era, the secular world moves toward human rights, democracy, and pluralism, and suddenly, miraculously, the church discovers that these values were actually dormant in the gospel all along.
It's incredibly convenient.
And honestly, reading through these sources, realizing how the definitions constantly shift, how the words are redefined, and how the rules adapt to fit the era, it brings me to how it actually feels to be a believer navigating this history. It can feel a lot like playing a rigged game.
Feels like walking into a casino.
Yes. Let's explore this house always wins scenario because the logic they've built is bulletproof, but almost in a sinister, unavoidable way.
Let's hear it.
Think about the structure. If the church is the literal, visible, only path to heaven, well, the church is right. But if the modern era proves that people entirely outside the church end up being saved, well, the church is still right. Because it turns out those people were secretly or materially connected to the church without knowing it.
No matter what reality presents, no matter what new continent is discovered, the house always wins the theological bet.
Exactly. You cannot prove them wrong because they own the definitions.
It creates a perfectly closed ideological loop, like it's an unfalsifiable system. And for many people, especially rigorous historians and strict traditionalists who value intellectual consistency, this constant redefining of terms feels deeply unsettling. It feels manipulative.
The sources actually use a very modern psychological word for it, gaslighting. It feels like institutional gaslighting on a global scale.
That's a strong word, but you can see where they're coming from.
You have an institution that rarely, if ever, explicitly says, we were wrong and we apologize for the error. Instead, it says, we are clarifying what we actually meant all along. But we have to stop and acknowledge the immense emotional toll of that tactic.
The human cost.
Yes. For centuries, regular, devout people lived in genuine, agonizing terror over these literal rules. Mothers wept and worried that their unbaptized babies were floating in limbo forever. People feared their non-Catholic neighbors were currently burning in hell.
To have a later generation of smooth theologians come along in the 1960s and say, we didn't mean it that literally, you misunderstood, it was just the pedagogy of the time. That feels like a profound betrayal of the blood, sweat, and intense anxiety of past generations.
It totally minimizes the historical trauma caused by the formula. The church essentially says the anxiety was a feature, not a bug, to keep you safe.
And to defend themselves against the modern charge of gaslighting, the church relies on what secular critics might call a highly lawyerly defense. They make a sharp distinction between the ordinary and extraordinary paths to salvation.
Okay, let's break out the theological legal pad. How does this ordinary versus extraordinary system work?
The church claims that the sacraments, baptism, going to Mass, obeying the Pope, and being in the visible church are the ordinary way to be saved. It's the standard paved highway to heaven.
And the extraordinary path.
God's sovereign, mysterious mercy for those outside the visible church. The invincible ignorance loophole is the extraordinary path. It's off-roading. The church argues that in the Middle Ages, they focused 100% of their rhetoric on the ordinary path.
They spoke as if it were the only path because they wanted to ensure people didn't get lazy, leave the church, or presume upon God's mercy.
Right. Today, they simply acknowledge the extraordinary path more openly. They claim they never technically said the extraordinary path didn't exist. They just didn't advertise it because their primary job is to run the ordinary shop.
We didn't lie to you. We just didn't advertise the alternate route because we wanted you to buy our ticket. That is wild. It's PR mixed with theology. But there is an even bigger legal loophole they use to protect themselves, right? The infallibility safety hatch. I want to really dive into the mechanics of this because it's fascinating.
Yes, the concept of papal infallibility. This is absolutely crucial to understanding how the house always wins and how they manage these pivots without shattering. The church is incredibly specific and legally careful about what it officially defines as an infallible statement.
Because an infallible statement, by definition, cannot be wrong. It is protected by the Holy Spirit.
Right. But the criteria for a pope to speak infallibly, to speak ex cathedra, or from the chair of Peter, are remarkably strict.
He has to explicitly state he is defining a dogma, binding the entire church, using his supreme apostolic authority.
Exactly. So when modern theologians look back at the embarrassing, overly rigid, politically motivated decrees from history, the ones they've had to walk back, like Unam Sanctum, they will parse the language and argue that these decrees were authoritative but not infallible.
It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card.
It really is.
If a teaching ages poorly over 500 years, the modern church can just pull out the rule book, examine the medieval text, and say, well, you see, Pope Boniface was speaking authoritatively, so as a peasant, you absolutely had to listen to him and obey at the time. But he didn't invoke the maximum level of infallibility. He forgot the magic words. So we, in the modern era, are completely free to revise it now.
To an outsider, that looks like a massive, cynical legal loophole designed to protect the brand.
And it's important to note that salvation isn't the only issue where this safety hatch or this concept of development has been heavily utilized. The sources highlight that this is a distinct historical pattern.
Yeah, there are other massive paradigm-shifting changes that deeply test the limits of Newman's acorn theory.
Right, let's briefly highlight those other flip-flops for context, because it shows the listener that this salvation issue isn't an isolated incident. It's a feature of the system. Look at usury, which is charging interest on a loan.
A huge deal in the Middle Ages.
In the medieval view, based on literal readings of scripture, charging any interest was considered a grave mortal sin. It was theft of time which belonged to God. It would send you straight to hell. Today, it's just standard economics. The Vatican literally runs a bank that charges interest.
Or consider religious liberty. For centuries, the old view was literally summarized as error has no rights. The Church taught that the Catholic state had a moral obligation to suppress non-Catholic worship to protect the truth.
But today, post-Vatican II, the Church actively champions the idea that every single human being has an inherent, God-given right to follow their conscience, even if they are wrong.
And perhaps most jarringly, the issue of slavery. For centuries, various forms of slavery were deemed theologically permissible under specific, complex conditions known as just title, often involving prisoners of war. Popes owned enslaved people.
And today, the Catechism unequivocally condemns slavery as an intrinsic evil that offends human dignity.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, you see an ancient institution walking an incredibly precarious, dizzying tightrope. It is the tightrope of static language versus fluid meaning.
Right. To survive the discovery of the New World, to survive the Enlightenment, to survive modern science and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Church had to be flexible. If it remained completely rigid and stuck in 1302, it would have died out as an irrelevant, barbaric, medieval relic.
But if it openly admits it was wrong, it loses its unique claim to be the divine killer of truth. So what does it do?
It keeps the old formulas, the static language, the ancient prayers, but it fundamentally completely changes how the universe of meaning behind those formulas is applied to the real world.
It's survival through constant, subtle redefinition.
But all of this theological maneuvering, all the acorns, the invisible ropes, the pedagogy defense, the legal safety hatches, reading through all of this, it all begs one final, massive, glaring question from the source text, and it's a question of origins.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Jesus Christ was the literal, physical incarnation of God, the absolute source of truth, why wasn't the map clearest on day one?
You are pointing to the apostolic gap.
Exactly. The apostles literally walked, ate, and talked with Jesus for years. They heard it straight from the source. The truth couldn't possibly have been clearer than it was in the first century in Galilee.
Right.
Any clarification or development that takes 1,500 years to figure out and involves reversing the literal meaning of your own medieval decrees looks a lot less like a beautiful flower blooming and a lot more like you just lost the plot entirely and had to invent a new one to survive.
That's a tough critique.
Why the 1,500-year detour into terror and literalism? Why didn't Jesus just say, hey, invincible ignorance is a thing, don't burn anybody?
It's the ultimate common sense question. And the defense the Church offers here is deeply rooted in human psychology and the difference between experience and formula.
Experience and formula.
Yes. The apostles had the relationship. They had what theologians call the fullness of revelation because they knew Jesus personally. They experienced the divine mercy firsthand. But they didn't have a systematic, heavily footnoted, bullet-pointed theological textbook to leave behind.
They had a lived, messy, beautiful experience, not a rigid legal card.
Exactly. And fast forward 1,300 years to the Middle Ages, The church is no longer a small band of fishermen. It is now trying to take that pure relational experience of the apostles and turn it into a massive legal, political, and philosophical framework required to manage an entire continent of millions of people.
In doing so, they were trying to build a conceptual fence around a profound mystery to protect it from being distorted.
The literalism of join or burn, the rigid decrees of 1302, that was the fence. The tragedy, the church might argue today in retrospect, is that over time, the human leaders of the church mistook the fence for the truth itself.
They forgot what was actually inside the fence, the mystery of mercy, and just started violently guarding the wood.
Precisely. They worshiped the boundary markers. And what's fascinating here is that the sources point out this tension between exclusion and inclusion, between the fence and the mystery, wasn't actually invented by medieval popes.
Really? Where did it come from?
The scriptural precedents for this profound confusion were there from the very beginning. You can see the push and pull, the tension, in the actual recorded words of Jesus himself.
Yeah, that's true. You have the exclusive Jesus who says things like, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's the Jesus the medieval popes love to quote. That builds a strong fence.
But then you have the inclusive Jesus who says things like, I have other sheep that are not of this sheepfold. I must bring them also.
Exactly. And the apostles themselves, the men who knew him best, struggled deeply with this.
Oh, massively. Just look at the story of Peter in the book of Acts, specifically chapter 10. Peter is recognized as the first pope, the leader of the apostles. He holds a very strict tribal Jewish Christian view of salvation.
But then he is absolutely shocked when he witnesses the Holy Spirit falling upon Cornelius,
Who was a Roman pagan, an uncircumcised centurion, a complete outsider to the covenant. God acts entirely outside the established rules, and Peter is forced to change his theology on the spot.
He actually says out loud, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism.
I now realize.
That is such a powerful, humbling phrase for a religious leader to utter.
It is the crux of the whole issue. The church claims that Peter's I now realize moment is the exact blueprint for its entire 2,000-year history. It is the biblical precedent for progressive revelation and doctrinal development.
Even the very first pope had to have his strict, tribal, literalist view corrected by a new, undeniable experience of God's expansive, rule-breaking mercy.
The modern church argues that it hasn't failed. Rather, it is just continuing to have those I now realize moments throughout history as the map expands and humanity matures.
So, after all of this, what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've walked through centuries of papal decrees, massive political struggles, theological loopholes, acorns mutating into oak trees, and constantly shifting global maps.
It's a lot to take in.
We've seen an incredible, almost unbelievable balancing act. The Catholic Church is desperately trying to be two entirely different things at once, divinely guided by an infallible truth, and historically messy as a human institution trying to survive.
And depending on how you weigh the historical and theological evidence we've discussed today, you are left with a few distinct, unavoidable conclusions.
You either view this history through the lens of strict traditionalism, believing the medieval popes were 100% right, the modern church has gone soft and heretical, and Father Feeney was a prophet.
Or you view it through a highly skeptical secular lens. You see a purely human geopolitical institution that gets arrogant, makes terrifying mistakes, realizes it's losing power, and desperately adjusts its doctrines using clever linguistic loopholes to survive whatever way the cultural wind is blowing.
Or you view it through the lens of modern Catholic theology, the belief that the church is indeed a divine hospital, but it is run by deeply flawed, politically influenced, sometimes incredibly narrow-minded human staff.
The tools they offer, the sacraments, might be perfect, but the human teachers are constantly, painfully having to learn and relearn the depth and mercy of their own doctrines over centuries.
It's that messy middle that makes this topic so utterly compelling to study, and it leaves me with one final thought, something that has been bouncing around in my head since we started unpacking these sources.
What's that?
We've spent this whole time seeing how human language is constantly evolving. A word like church or a concept like salvation meant something entirely terrifyingly different to a peasant in the 14th century than it does to a highly educated theologian sitting in the Vatican today. The words are identical, but the universe of meaning inside them is completely different.
The words remain static, carved in stone, but the universe of meaning inside them expands and contracts based on the era.
Right. So here is the question I want to leave you with, something for you to mull over on your own after this deep dive is over.
Okay.
If human language is truly that fluid, if our understanding of words is entirely captive to the century we happen to live in and the map we happen to possess, is it even possible for any human institution to write a single, unchangeable, infallible sentence that can accurately span the entirety of human history? Or is truth always, inevitably, destined to outgrow the words we use to trap it?
Maybe we are all just staring at an X-ray, trying to definitively diagnose a mystery that simply refuses to sit still.
The murky waters. I love that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking closely at the blueprints of the institutions you encounter, and we will catch you next time.